Grace Williams stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of her Manhattan apartment, watching the autumn leaves drift down in Central Park below. At 67, she still carried herself with the poise of a woman who had spent 4 decades navigating hospital corridors and managing crisis situations as a registered nurse. Her silver hair, styled in a sophisticated bob, caught the afternoon light streaming through the glass. The apartment had been her sanctuary for 43 years. She and her late husband, Robert, had bought it in 1982 for $180,000, a stretch on a nurse's and accountant's combined salaries. But they'd fallen in love with the crown molding, the hardwood floors that gleamed like honey, and those magnificent windows overlooking the park. Today, similar units in the building sold for well over $1 million. Every corner held memories. The kitchen where Robert had taught their son David to make his famous Sunday pancakes. The living room where David had taken his first steps, reaching for the coffee table that still bore a small scar from his teething years. The master bedroom where she'd held Robert's hand during his final days, promising to keep their home exactly as it was. "Mom, this place is so big for just one person." David's words from last week's dinner echoed in her mind. Her 42-year-old son had been making such comments with increasing frequency, usually followed by Jessica's helpful additions about lovely retirement communities and the benefits of assisted living. Grace picked up the framed photograph from the side table. David's college graduation. Herself and Robert beaming with pride as their son posed in his cap and gown. The young man in that photo had been grateful, ambitious, full of dreams about his finance career. When had that earnest young man become someone who saw his childhood home as an inconvenience? The intercom buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. "Mrs. Williams, your son and daughter-in-law are here to see you. Send them up, please, Marcus." She smoothed her cashmere sweater and prepared to put on the smile that had become increasingly difficult to maintain. David arrived with Jessica and their twin daughters, Emma and Sophie, both 15, and the bright spots in Grace's increasingly complicated family dynamics. The girls rushed to hug their grandmother, chattering about school and friends with the easy affection that reminded Grace why family mattered. "Grandma Grace, look what I made in art class." Sophie pulled out a watercolor painting of Central Park in autumn, the trees rendered in brilliant oranges and reds. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. Should we frame it for the kitchen?" While Grace admired Sophie's artwork, she noticed David and Jessica exchanging glances, the kind of wordless communication that suggested they'd discussed something beforehand. Over the years, Grace had developed a finely tuned instinct for reading people, a skill essential for managing difficult patients and their families. During dinner, David seemed unusually tense. He picked at his food and kept checking his phone, despite Jessica's pointed looks. Finally, as Grace served dessert, he cleared his throat. "Mom, Jessica and I wanted to talk to you about something." He glanced at his wife, who nodded encouragingly. "We're having some unexpected expenses with the girls' college prep programs, and there's been a delay with one of my bonuses at work. I was wondering if you might be able to help us out with a loan, just temporarily." "Of course." Grace set down the serving spoon carefully. It wasn't the first such request. Over the past 2 years, these temporary loans had become increasingly frequent. $5,000 for home repairs, $3,000 for Jessica's mother's medical bills, $8,000 for the twins' summer programs. "How much do you need, dear?" "15,000. I know it's a lot, but I can transfer it tomorrow." Grace interrupted, watching relief flood her son's face. "But David, I think we should discuss setting up a more formal repayment plan. These loans are adding up." Jessica leaned forward, her smile bright but not quite reaching her eyes. "Oh, Grace, you're absolutely right. We should be more organized about it. David's just been stressed about wanting to give the girls every opportunity. You know how parents worry." After they left, Grace sat in her quiet apartment with a cup of tea, thinking about the evening. Something felt different about this request. more calculated, less apologetic. And Jessica's immediate agreement about a repayment plan seemed too smooth, as if she'd anticipated the suggestion. The next morning, Grace transferred the money, but also did something she'd never done before she started keeping a detailed record of every loan, including the original reasons given and the promised repayment dates. None of the previous loans had been repaid. Over the following months, the pattern escalated. David's requests for money became more frequent and urgent, while his explanations became increasingly elaborate. Jessica's visits to the apartment increased as well, always with seemingly innocent purposes, bringing soup when Grace had a minor cold, checking on her after a building-wide power outage, or simply wanting to spend time together. During these visits, Jessica would wander through the apartment with an appraising eye that made Grace increasingly uncomfortable. She'd comment on the beautiful crown molding, the value of Grace's antique furniture, the charm of older buildings, and always, eventually, the conversation would turn to Grace's future plans. "Have you given any thought to downsizing?" Jessica asked during one visit, settling into the living room sofa with practiced familiarity. "I was reading an article about how freeing it can be for seniors to simplify their lives." Grace continued folding laundry, keeping her voice neutral. "I'm quite comfortable here. Thank you." "Of course, but practically speaking, the maintenance fees alone on a place like this could pay for a lovely condo somewhere warmer. Florida has such nice retirement communities now, active adult lifestyles, social activities, medical facilities nearby." "Jessica, I appreciate your concern, but I have no intention of leaving my home." Jessica's smile never wavered, but Grace caught a flash of something harder in her eyes. "I just worry about you being here alone. What if something happened? What if you fell or had a medical emergency? David would never forgive himself if he hadn't encouraged you to be somewhere safer." That evening, Grace found herself walking through her apartment, seeing it through Jessica's calculating gaze. The valuable paintings Robert had collected, the antique furniture passed down through her family, the apartment itself, worth well over $1 million in today's market. She was sitting on a fortune, and her son's family was drowning in debt they seemed unable to manage despite David's substantial salary. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. David's voice was strained, almost panicked. "Mom, I'm sorry to call so late, but we have a crisis. Jessica's mother needs emergency surgery, and our insurance won't cover everything. I need $50,000, and I need it immediately." Grace felt something shift inside her chest, a cold clarity that replaced the warm concern she'd always felt for her son's problems. "David, slow down. Tell me exactly what's happening." "There's no time to explain everything. The surgery is scheduled for tomorrow morning. If we can't pay the deposit—" "David, what hospital I can call and speak with the financial office?" "No." His voice was sharp, almost angry. "Mom, this isn't the time for your questions and procedures. This is family. Jessica's mother could die if we don't act fast." Grace closed her eyes, recognizing the manipulation tactics she'd seen countless times in her nursing career, creating false urgency, emotional blackmail, making the victim feel guilty for asking reasonable questions. "I'll need to review my finances and get back to you tomorrow." Tomorrow could be too late. David's voice rose. "I can't believe you're being so cold about this. We're talking about a woman's life, and you're worried about paperwork." After he hung up, Grace sat in the darkness of her living room, finally acknowledging what she'd been trying to deny for months. Her son and daughter-in-law weren't just irresponsible with money. They were systematically manipulating her, and their requests were escalating towards something much more serious than loans. The next morning, Grace called David back and agreed to transfer the $50,000, but something had fundamentally changed in their relationship. She began paying attention to details she'd previously overlooked, and what she discovered made her blood run cold. Jessica's visits became even more frequent, but now Grace noticed how her daughter-in-law would photograph certain rooms when she thought Grace wasn't looking. During family dinners, David would steer conversations toward Grace's health, her memory, her ability to manage the apartment's maintenance issues. "Mom, you left the stove on yesterday when we called," he said during one visit, his voice heavy with concern. "That could have been dangerous." She sighed. Grace remembered the incident clearly. She'd been cooking dinner when David called with another financial emergency, and she'd turned off the burner before answering the phone. But she didn't correct him, instead filing away his lie for future reference. Dr. Michael Roberts, David's golf partner, began calling regularly, claiming to offer wellness checks for seniors in the building. When Grace politely declined his services, he became more insistent, suggesting that her reluctance to seek medical advice was itself a sign of declining judgment. The most disturbing development came when Grace noticed Jessica asking pointed questions about the building's policies regarding estate transfers and family sales. She'd presented herself to the management company as Grace's concerned daughter-in-law, explaining that she was helping plan for Grace's future care needs. Grace realized with growing horror that David and Jessica weren't just hoping she'd eventually agree to sell the apartment. They were actively planning to force her out. The mentions of assisted living, the questions about her mental state, the doctor's wellness checks, it was all building towards something that would strip away her legal right to make decisions about her own life. One evening, while pretending to nap in her bedroom, Grace overheard a conversation between David and Jessica that confirmed her worst fears. "We can't wait much longer," Jessica whispered urgently. "She's getting suspicious, and the real estate market won't stay hot forever. Dr. Roberts says he's ready to do the evaluation whenever we give him the word," David replied. "But we need to be careful about timing. If we move too fast, she might fight us." "She's already fighting us. Did you see how she looked at those power of attorney papers? She knows something." Grace lay perfectly still, her heart pounding as she listened to her son and daughter-in-law plan her imprisonment. "Once Roberts declares her incompetent, she won't have any legal standing," David continued. "We'll be her guardians, and we can do whatever we think is best for her." Jessica actually laughed. "I can't wait to see her face when she realizes what's happening. All these years of her acting superior, judging our choices. Finally, she'll understand who's really in control." Grace had heard enough. The next morning, she made a phone call that would change everything. Detective Susan Blake had 25 years of experience investigating domestic crimes, and she'd seen every variation of elder abuse imaginable. When Grace Williams called her office, describing her suspicions about her son and daughter-in-law's intentions, Detective Blake recognized the pattern immediately. "Mrs. Williams, I want you to understand that what you're describing is a serious crime," Detective Blake said during their first meeting in her downtown office. "If they're planning to force you into a care facility against your will and steal your assets, we're talking about elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy charges." Grace sat across from the detective, her hands folded calmly in her lap, despite the gravity of the situation. "Detective Blake, I spent 40 years as a nurse. I've seen what happens to people who lose control of their lives. I won't let that happen to me." Over the following weeks, Detective Blake's investigation revealed the full scope of David and Jessica's planning. They'd consulted with multiple real estate agents, getting detailed appraisals of Grace's apartment. They'd researched guardianship proceedings and mental competency requirements. Most damning of all, they'd already visited several assisted living facilities, not for research purposes, but to get pricing information and availability. "They've been planning this for months," Detective Blake told Grace, spreading the evidence across her desk. "Bank records show they're in serious financial trouble, credit card debt, mortgage issues. Your son apparently has a gambling problem that goes back to college." Grace stared at the financial records, finally understanding the true scope of her son's desperation. Gambling. Online poker, sports betting, casino visits. He's hidden it well, but the debt is substantial. They see your apartment as their salvation. The most heartbreaking revelation came when Detective Blake played a recording she'd obtained of David and Jessica meeting with a real estate agent. When asked directly if Grace was agreeable to selling, David's response chilled Grace to the bone. "My mother is getting older and confused about financial matters. We're just trying to protect her assets and make sure she's taken care of. She'll understand eventually that this is for the best." Grace listened to her son's voice betraying everything she'd taught him about honesty, integrity, and respect for others. The young man she'd raised was gone, replaced by someone who could lie with casual ease about his own mother's mental state. "What they're planning isn't just theft," Detective Blake explained. "They intend to have you declared mentally incompetent, gain legal guardianship, and then isolate you in a facility where you'd have no visitors and no ability to contest their actions. It's a complete erasure of your identity and autonomy." That night, Grace made the hardest decision of her life. She was going to stop David and Jessica before they could destroy her, but she wasn't going to do it quietly. She was going to make sure they faced the full consequences of their choices. Grace's lawyer, Joan Mitchell, had handled her family's legal affairs for 15 years. When Grace called to request an emergency meeting, Joan immediately cleared her schedule. "Grace, what you're describing is legally actionable. But are you sure you want to pursue this path?" Joan asked, reviewing the evidence Detective Blake had gathered. "These are serious criminal charges against your own son." Grace looked out the window of Joan's law office, watching people hurry along the sidewalk below. All of them presumably going about normal lives with normal family relationships. "Joan, let me tell you about the son I raised." "Betkasan." For the next hour, Grace told Joan about David's childhood, how she'd worked double shifts to pay for his college tuition, going without new clothes for years to make sure he had everything he needed, how she'd supported him through his early career struggles, celebrated his successes, welcomed Jessica into their family despite her reservations. "I gave him everything I had," Grace said quietly. "I thought I was raising a man who would protect and care for those he loved. Instead, I apparently raised someone who sees love as weakness to be exploited." Joan nodded sympathetically. "Grace, I have to ask, is there any part of you that wonders if David might be genuinely concerned about your welfare? Perhaps misguided, but well-intentioned?" Grace pulled out her phone and played one of the recordings Detective Blake had obtained. Jessica's voice filled the office. "The important thing is getting her into a facility far enough away that she won't have visitors. Somewhere she can't call people and complain about how we're spending her money." Joan's expression hardened as she listened. "I withdraw my question. No one who loves you would speak about you that way." That evening, Grace sat in her apartment, surrounded by 43 years of memories, and began the legal process that would protect her home and her future. Joan arranged to transfer the apartment into an irrevocable trust, with Grace as the beneficiary for life and specific provisions that would prevent anyone from forcing her removal. But the legal protections were only part of Grace's plan. If David and Jessica wanted to play games with her mental competency, she was going to let them, right up until the moment their actions became criminal. The hardest part was accepting that the relationship she'd treasured with her son was based on a fundamental misunderstanding. She'd thought she was his beloved mother. He saw her as a resource to be managed and eventually depleted. That realization hurt more than any physical pain she'd ever experienced. Detective Blake had connections throughout the law enforcement community, and she used them to help Grace set up what she called the counter operation. If David and Jessica wanted to commit elder abuse, they were going to do it while being recorded by multiple sources. "We need to let them think they're succeeding," Detective Blake explained to Grace and Joan during a planning meeting. "The more confident they become, the more evidence they'll create against themselves." The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Grace would appear to gradually succumb to the pressure, signing preliminary documents and agreeing to evaluations. but everything would be carefully orchestrated to build a legal case against David and Jessica while protecting Grace's actual interests. Joan arranged for the apartment trust transfer, making it legally impossible for anyone to sell the property without Grace's explicit consent, regardless of any guardianship proceedings. The power of attorney documents David was so eager for Grace to sign would be worthless. Detective Blake helped Grace install discreet surveillance equipment throughout the apartment, tiny cameras and audio recorders that would capture every conversation and interaction. In New York State, one-party consent meant Grace could legally record conversations in her own home without informing other participants. "The key is patience," Detective Blake advised. "We need them to commit to their plan so completely that they can't claim it was just a misunderstanding. We need evidence of conspiracy, coercion, and intent to defraud." Grace also began taking acting lessons of sorts, learning to portray the confused, declining woman David and Jessica expected to see. It was perhaps the most challenging performance of her life, appearing weak when she felt stronger and more determined than ever. The fake buyer component of the plan was more complex but achievable. Detective Blake had contacts in corporate security who could create a shell company and provide actors to play potential purchasers. The goal was to let David and Jessica believe they'd successfully arranged a sale, right up until the moment police arrived to arrest them. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Joan asked Grace during their final preparation meeting. "Once we begin, there's no going back. Your son and daughter-in-law will face serious prison time." Grace thought about Emma and Sophie, her innocent granddaughters who would suffer because of their parents' choices. She thought about the young man David had once been, full of promise and potential. Then she thought about Jessica's voice on the recording, laughing about isolating an elderly woman in a facility where she'd have no visitors. "They made their choice," Grace said firmly. "Now they'll face the consequences." Over the next several weeks, Grace played her role perfectly. She began forgetting small details during conversations with David and Jessica, appearing confused about finances, and expressing worry about managing the apartment's upkeep. David's response was immediate and telling. Instead of offering help or support, he saw opportunity. He began bringing legal documents to every visit, updated emergency contact forms, healthcare proxies, and most importantly, power of attorney papers that would give him complete control over Grace's finances. "Mom, these are just precautionary measures," he explained, spreading the documents across her dining room table. "What happens if you have a stroke or a fall? How will anyone be able to help you if your affairs aren't in order?" Grace played her part beautifully, asking confused questions and expressing concerns about signing documents she didn't understand. But she never actually signed anything, always finding excuses. Her reading glasses needed cleaning. She wanted her lawyer to review everything first. She needed time to think. Jessica's patience began wearing thin. During one visit, she brought printed articles about seniors who died in preventable accidents, always with the same concerned expression. "Grace, I just worry about you being here all alone," Jessica said, showing Grace photos of assisted living facilities on her tablet. "What if something happened and no one found you for days? These places have medical staff available 24 hours a day." And the surveillance equipment captured everything: David's growing frustration with Grace's confusion, Jessica's barely concealed calculation as she photographed valuable items in the apartment, and most damning of all, their private conversations when they thought Grace couldn't hear them. Dr. Page Roberts finally scheduled Grace's mental competency evaluation, timing it perfectly to provide legal justification for David's planned actions. What Dr. Roberts didn't know was that Detective Blake had already contacted the state medical board about his unethical practices. His license was under investigation, and every evaluation he'd conducted was being reviewed for fraud. The most satisfying part of the plan was watching David and Jessica's confidence grow. They truly believed they'd broken Grace's resistance and that their scheme was proceeding flawlessly. They started making concrete plans for their post-apartment lifestyle, discussing the house they'd buy, the private schools for Emma and Sophie, even a vacation to Europe to recover from the stress of caring for Grace. Grace listened to these conversations with perfect composure, counting down the days until their world would implode. The investigation into David's background revealed a pattern of deception that went back years. Detective Blake had uncovered evidence of gambling addiction that began in college and had escalated dramatically over the past 5 years. "Your son owes money to some very dangerous people," Detective Blake told Grace privately. "Online gambling sites, illegal sports books, private poker games. The apartment sale isn't just about greed, it's about survival." Grace absorbed this information with mixed emotions. Learning about David's addiction helped explain his desperation, but it didn't excuse his willingness to destroy his mother's life to solve his problems. The most revealing conversation came when Detective Blake showed Grace a recording of David and Jessica discussing their plans with brutal honesty. "I can't keep lying to these people," David said. His voice strained with stress. "They want their money, and they're not going to wait much longer." "Then we stop waiting too," Jessica replied coldly. "Your mother is being selfish, hoarding all that money while her own family suffers. We're doing what's necessary to protect our children's future. What if she fights us? What if she tries to stop the sale? She's an old woman, David. Once Dr. Roberts declares her incompetent, what can she do? We'll have legal guardianship, and she'll be exactly where she belongs, in a facility where she can't interfere with our lives anymore." Grace realized that while David's gambling had created the crisis, Jessica was the one driving the solution. Her daughter-in-law had seen an opportunity in David's desperation and was manipulating him toward increasingly criminal behavior. But understanding their motivations didn't change Grace's resolve. If anything, it strengthened her determination to stop them before they destroyed more lives. Emma and Sophie deserved better than parents who would commit felonies rather than face the consequences of their poor choices. Grace had carefully orchestrated what would be the final confrontation with David and Jessica. She knew that, for her plan to work completely, she needed them to fully commit to their scheme, to cross the line from planning into actual criminal action. But she also knew that part of her, the mother who had raised David from infancy, needed to give him one last chance to choose differently. It was a cold Tuesday evening in December when Grace decided to force the issue. She had Detective Blake arrange for the fake buyer to call the apartment while David and Jessica were visiting, ostensibly to confirm details about the closing scheduled for the following week. Grace answered the phone in the living room, where David and Jessica were reviewing the assisted living facility brochures they'd brought for her consideration. She made sure her voice carried clearly as she spoke to the supposed buyer. "Yes. Mr. Hudson, I understand the closing is set for next Tuesday at 10 o'clock, Grace said, watching David and Jessica exchange excited glances. "No, my son has power of attorney, so he'll handle all the paperwork. Yes, 1.2 million is acceptable. No, I won't be attending. David thinks it's too stressful for someone in my condition." When she hung up, the silence in the room was electric. David's face had gone pale, and Jessica's carefully maintained composure was cracking around the edges. "Mom," David said slowly. "What was that phone call about?" Grace turned to face them, her expression perfectly innocent. "Oh, that was the man who's buying the apartment. Didn't you want me to cooperate with the sale? I thought this was what you both wanted." Jessica found her voice first. "Grace, what are you talking about? We never arranged any sale. We've been trying to help you understand your options, but we haven't—" "Haven't what?" Grace interrupted, dropping the confused elderly woman act entirely. "Haven't been meeting with real estate agents behind my back. Haven't been researching guardianship proceedings. Haven't been planning to have me declared mentally incompetent so you can steal my home." The color drained completely from David's face. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Jessica, however, immediately went on the offensive. "That's ridiculous," she said, her voice shrill with false indignation. "We've been trying to help you plan for your future care needs. You're obviously confused about—" "I'm not confused, Jessica," Grace said, her voice cutting through the other woman's protests like a blade. "I'm disappointed. Deeply, profoundly disappointed in both of you." David finally found his voice. "Mom, you don't understand. We're not trying to hurt you. We're trying to protect you. This apartment is too much for you to handle alone, and you've been making some questionable decisions lately. Questionable decisions." Grace's voice rose slightly, the first crack in her controlled composure. "Like what, David? Like working double shifts for 5 years to pay for your college education? Like giving you every loan you've asked for without question? Like trusting you with my life and my future?" "That's not what I meant," David said desperately. "I meant, you left the stove on last week, and you forgot about that doctor's appointment, and—" "I didn't forget anything, and I never left the stove on," Grace said coldly. "You've been lying about my mental state to justify what you're planning to do to me. But let me be very clear about something. My mind is perfectly sharp, and I know exactly what you and your wife have been plotting." Jessica jumped to her feet, her mask of concern finally slipping completely. "Now wait just a minute. We've done nothing but try to help you, and this is the thanks we get. You're being paranoid and unreasonable." "Sit down, Jessica," Grace said with such authority that the younger woman actually complied. "We're going to have an honest conversation for once in our relationship." David looked between his mother and his wife, clearly realizing that their carefully constructed plan was unraveling. "Mom, please. You have to understand the pressure we're under. The gambling debts, Jessica's spending, the girl's future." Grace felt something shift inside her chest. This was the first time David had admitted to the gambling, and for a moment she saw her little boy again, caught in a lie, ashamed, but still hoping to escape consequences. "How long, David?" she asked quietly. "How long what? How long have you been gambling? And don't lie to me. I already know most of it." David's shoulders sagged as if a great weight had been placed on them. "Since college. It started small, poker games in the dorm, sports betting with friends. I thought I could control it." Jessica shot him a venomous look. "David, don't." "No, Jessica. She already knows." David turned back to his mother, tears starting to form in his eyes. "It got worse after we got married. The pressure to provide, to give you and the girls everything you wanted. Online poker seemed like a quick solution. Then it became the only way I knew how to cope with stress." "How much do you owe?" Grace asked. $200,000. Maybe more." David's voice was barely a whisper. "To some very dangerous people who don't accept late payments." Grace felt her heart breaking for her son, but she also felt a cold fury at what he was asking her to sacrifice. "So instead of getting help, instead of admitting your problem and seeking treatment, you decided to solve it by stealing my home and having me locked away in a nursing home." "We weren't going to lock you away," David protested weakly. "The facility we found is very nice. Against my will." Grace interrupted. "You were planning to have me declared mentally incompetent so you could override my wishes and take control of my life. Do you understand what that means, David? You were planning to erase me as a person." Jessica stood up again, her face flushed with anger. "You're being dramatic. We were trying to find a solution that would help everyone. You'd be safe and cared for. We'd be able to solve our financial problems, and the girls would have a secure future." "By destroying their grandmother's autonomy and dignity," Grace said. by teaching them that it's acceptable to steal from elderly people when you need money, by showing them that family loyalty means enabling criminal behavior. Criminal behavior. David's voice cracked. "Mom, we're your family. We love you. Everything we were planning was to protect you." Grace stood up, her full height and authority commanding the room. "Love doesn't steal, David. Love doesn't lie. Love doesn't conspire to deprive someone of their basic human rights. What you feel for me isn't love. It's entitlement." The room fell silent, except for the sound of David's quiet sobbing. Jessica's face was a mask of fury and calculation, clearly trying to figure out how to salvage their plan. "Fine," Jessica said finally. "You want to be stubborn and selfish. That's your choice. But don't come crying to us when you fall and break a hip, or when you can't remember to take your medications, or when—" "Jessica, stop!" Grace's voice was like ice. "You're in my home, talking about stealing my life, and you have the audacity to call me selfish. Get out!" "Mom, please," David begged, reaching for her hands. "I know we've made mistakes, but we can fix this. We can find another way." Grace pulled her hands away from her son's grasp. "David, you could have come to me 6 months ago and told me about your gambling problem. You could have asked for help finding treatment. You could have been honest about your debts and your fears. Instead, you chose to conspire against me with your wife. You chose to lie about my mental state to justify stealing from me. Those choices have consequences." "What are you going to do?" David asked, his voice small and frightened. Grace looked at her son, really looked at him, and saw a stranger wearing a familiar face. The boy she'd raised with love and sacrifice had become a man who would sacrifice her freedom for his financial convenience. "I'm going to protect myself from people who want to harm me," she said simply. "The fact that one of those people is my son is simply tragic." The next morning, Grace was surprised to find Emma standing outside her apartment door when she went to retrieve the newspaper. Her 15-year-old granddaughter looked like she hadn't slept, her usually neat hair disheveled and her eyes red with tears. "Emma, sweetheart, what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be in school?" "I needed to talk to you," Emma said, her voice shaky. "Grandma Grace, please can I come in? It's important." Grace led Emma into the kitchen and began preparing tea, noting how her granddaughter's hands trembled as she sat at the small breakfast table. This was the table where Grace had helped both twins with homework over the years, where they'd had countless conversations about school and friends and growing up. Now it was about to become the site of the most difficult conversation they'd ever had. "Emma, what's wrong? Did something happen at home?" "I heard them," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Last night, after Dad came home from here, they were fighting in their bedroom, and Sophie and I could hear everything through the walls." Grace's heart sank. She'd hoped to keep the twins out of this ugliness for as long as possible. "They were talking about you, and about money, and about some plan that wasn't working anymore." Emma looked up at Grace with confusion and pain. "Grandma, is it true? Were they really trying to steal from you?" Grace sat down across from Emma, choosing her words carefully. "Emma, your parents are in serious financial trouble. Your father has a gambling addiction that's put your family in debt to some very dangerous people. Your mother convinced him that taking my apartment was the only solution." "But that's stealing," Emma said, as if the concept was incomprehensible. "You can't steal from family. You can't steal from someone who loves you and has always helped you." "You're absolutely right," Grace said gently, "but people sometimes make terrible choices when they're desperate and scared." Emma was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Dad was crying, she said finally. I've never heard my dad cry before. He kept saying he was sorry, and Mom kept telling him to shut up and think of a new plan. Grace felt a stab of pain for her son. Even after everything that had happened. Emma, what did you hear them say about a new plan? Mom said they needed to move faster, that you were suspicious and might try to stop them. She said something about a doctor who owed Dad a favor, and about having you declared, I don't remember the word, incompetent, Grace supplied grimly. That's it. What does that mean? Grace took a deep breath, trying to explain adult cruelties to a child who shouldn't have to understand them. It means they were planning to have a doctor say that I couldn't think clearly anymore, so they could make all my decisions for me, including the decision to sell my apartment and move into a nursing home. Emma's eyes widened with horror. But you're not sick. You're sharper than most people half your age. How could a doctor say that? Because your father and the doctor are friends, and the doctor was willing to lie for money. That's evil, Emma said, and Grace was struck by her granddaughter's moral clarity. Grandma, you can't let them do that to you. I don't intend to, Grace said. But Emma, I need you to understand that stopping them is going to have serious consequences for your family. Your parents could go to prison for what they've been planning. Emma was quiet for several minutes, staring into her teacup. When she looked up, her eyes were filled with tears, but also with a kind of adult determination that broke Grace's heart. Grandma, can I ask you something? Of course, sweetheart. If you don't stop them, and they do what they're planning, what happens to you? Grace considered how honest to be. I would lose my home, my freedom, and my right to make decisions about my own life. I would probably die in a nursing home, isolated from everyone I love. While your parents spent my money and told people I was too sick to have visitors. Emma nodded slowly. And if you do stop them, what happens to Mom and Dad? They'll face the legal consequences of their choices. Prison, probably. Financial ruin, certainly. What about Sophie and me? This was the question Grace had been dreading. You would probably have to live with relatives while your parents are in prison. Your lives would change dramatically. Emma was crying now, but she wiped her eyes with fierce determination. Grandma, I don't want you to be hurt. I don't want anyone to steal your life or lock you away somewhere. If Mom and Dad are planning to do that, then they're wrong, and they need to be stopped. Grace reached across the table and took Emma's hands. Emma, are you sure this decision will affect the rest of your life? I'm sure, Emma said firmly. Sophie and I can handle whatever happens. We're stronger than Mom and Dad think we are. But you shouldn't have to sacrifice yourself to protect them from their own bad choices. An hour later, Sophie arrived at the apartment, clearly sent by Emma's text message. The conversation was similar, but even more painful. As Sophie initially begged Grace to find some way to help their parents without involving the police. Can't you just give them the money? Sophie pleaded. I mean, if it's going to be ours someday anyway, couldn't you help them now so they don't have to do this? Sophie, this isn't just about money. Grace explained patiently. Your parents were planning to destroy my life to solve their problems. They were going to steal my dignity, my freedom, and my right to make my own choices. That's not something you do to someone you love. But they're our parents, Sophie said desperately. There has to be another way. Emma, who had been quiet during most of this conversation, finally spoke up. Sophie, what if it was you? What if someone wanted to lock you up somewhere and take away all your choices because it was convenient for them? Would you want Grandma Grace to just let it happen? Sophie looked between her sister and her grandmother, the moral complexity of the situation clearly weighing on her 15-year-old mind. No, she said finally. I wouldn't want that to happen to anyone. Then you understand why I can't let it happen to me, Grace said gently. Both girls were crying now, grieving for the family they'd thought they had, and the future they'd imagined. Grace held them both, her own heart breaking for the innocence they were losing and the adult burdens they would now have to carry. "Girls, no matter what happens between your parents and me, I will always love you both. I will always be here for you, and I will make sure you have what you need for college and your futures. But I can't let fear for what might happen to you stop me from protecting myself from people who want to harm me." When the twins left that afternoon, Grace felt the weight of her decision more heavily than ever, but she also felt a fierce pride in her granddaughter's moral courage and their understanding that love doesn't justify evil actions. The fake closing was scheduled for 10 o'clock on a Wednesday morning at Tyler Morrison's downtown office. Grace had barely slept the night before, alternating between determination and doubt about what she was about to do. The conversation with Emma and Sophie had reinforced her resolve, but it had also made the human cost of justice painfully clear. Detective Blake had called that morning to confirm that everyone was in position: the fake buyer, the undercover officers, the surveillance equipment. Everything was ready for David and Jessica to walk into the trap they'd set for themselves. Grace dressed carefully that morning, choosing a navy blue suit that made her feel authoritative and strong. If this was to be the last time she saw her son as a free man, she wanted to face him with dignity intact. She arrived at Morrison's office 15 minutes early, playing the role of the confused elderly woman one final time. Morrison, who had been instrumental in planning what he thought was a legitimate, if ethically questionable, transaction, greeted her with the false sympathy she'd come to recognize in people who preyed on the elderly. "Mrs. Williams, I'm so glad your family was able to help you make this difficult decision," he said, guiding her to a chair in the conference room. "I know this must be overwhelming, but you're doing the right thing." Grace smiled vaguely and nodded, while internally cataloging every word for the legal proceedings that would follow. David and Jessica arrived precisely on time, both dressed in their best clothes and carrying themselves with the confidence of people who believed they'd successfully manipulated an elderly woman. David wore the same suit he'd worn to his college graduation, and for a moment Grace was transported back to that proud day when she'd thought she was sending an honorable man into the world. "Mom, how are you feeling about today?" David asked, sitting beside her and taking her hand in what probably looked like filial affection to observers. "A little nervous," Grace replied truthfully, "but I trust you to handle everything." Jessica beamed at this, no doubt interpreting it as final confirmation that their plan had succeeded. "Grace, you're being so brave about all this. I know it's hard to let go of the past, but you're going to love your new living situation." The fake buyer, playing his role perfectly, arrived with his attorney and began the process of reviewing documents. For nearly 20 minutes, the closing proceeded exactly as David and Jessica expected. Papers were signed, funds were verified, and hands were shaken all around. Tyler Morrison produced a cashier's check for $1.2 million, made out to David as Grace's legal representative, for exactly 17 minutes. David and Jessica believed they'd successfully stolen Grace's life savings. Then Detective Blake walked into the conference room. "David Williams and Jessica Parker," she announced, her voice cutting through the celebratory atmosphere like a knife. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit elder abuse, fraud, attempted theft of property, and conspiracy to deprive an elderly person of their civil rights." The transformation in David's face was instantaneous and heartbreaking. Confusion gave way to disbelief, then to terror, and finally to a kind of hollow recognition that his life as he knew it was over. Jessica's reaction was more dramatic. She screamed and actually tried to run for the door before being restrained by officers who had been positioned outside. "This is impossible," David shouted as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. "This is a legitimate transaction. My mother signed all the papers. I have power of attorney." Detective Blake's smile was grim as she read him his rights. "Mr. Williams, Your mother transferred this apartment into an irrevocable trust 3 weeks ago, making your power of attorney worthless. More importantly, we have hours of video and audio evidence of you coercing someone you claim is mentally incompetent to sign legal documents. That's elder abuse, and it's a federal crime. The look on David's face when he realized Grace had outmaneuvered him completely was worth every sleepless night she'd spent planning this moment. He turned to stare at her, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly as the full scope of his situation became clear. "Mom," he whispered, his voice breaking. How could you do this? I'm your son." Grace stood up slowly, her composure perfect despite the chaos around her. "David, you stopped being my son the moment you decided to steal my life to pay your gambling debts. What you became was a criminal who happened to share my DNA." Jessica was screaming now as officers led her toward the door. "This is entrapment. This is a setup. We were trying to help her." "You were trying to help yourselves," Grace said quietly, but her words seemed to cut through Jessica's hysteria. "And now you'll face the consequences of that choice." Tyler Morrison was also being arrested, his history of exploiting elderly clients having finally caught up with him. Dr. Roberts would be taken into custody within the hour, his medical license suspended, and his fraudulent evaluation practices exposed. As the officers prepared to transport David and Jessica to booking, David turned back to his mother one final time. "Mom, please, think about Emma and Sophie. Think about what this will do to them." Grace felt her heart constrict, but her voice remained steady. "I'm thinking about them. David, I'm thinking about what kind of lesson it would teach them if I enabled your criminal behavior. I'm thinking about what kind of future they'll have if they learn that family loyalty means allowing people to steal from you and abuse you. But they're just children. They don't deserve to suffer for our mistakes." "You're right," Grace said. "They don't deserve to suffer. But that should have occurred to you before you decided to commit crimes to solve your problems." As David was led away, Grace heard him call back to her, "I loved you, Mom. Everything I did was because I loved you." Grace stood in the empty conference room long after everyone else had gone, staring at the cashier's check that would never be cashed and thinking about love and its counterfeits. David might have convinced himself that his actions were motivated by love, but Grace knew better. Love doesn't steal. Love doesn't lie. Love doesn't try to erase someone's existence for money. What David had felt for her was need, entitlement, and desperation, emotions that could masquerade as love, but were ultimately its opposite. Real love would have brought him to her honestly, admitting his problems and asking for help. Real love would have protected her autonomy and dignity, even at the cost of his own comfort. As Grace walked out of Tyler Morrison's office and into the bright December morning, she felt the strange mixture of relief and sorrow that comes with surviving a betrayal by people who should have protected you. Justice had been served, but the cost was higher than she'd ever imagined. The family she'd thought she had was gone forever. But perhaps something new and more honest could be built from the ashes of her old illusions. Emma and Sophie had shown her that courage and moral clarity could survive even the worst family tragedies. That knowledge would have to be enough to sustain her through the difficult times ahead. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and unforgiving. David and Jessica had created such a comprehensive evidence trail that their lawyers could only advise them to plead guilty and hope for reduced sentences. Dr. Roberts was arrested at his office the same day, charged with conspiracy to commit fraud and professional misconduct. Tyler Morrison, the real estate agent, faced multiple charges related to his history of exploiting elderly clients. The investigation into his business practices revealed a pattern of similar crimes spanning several years. But the most devastating consequences were personal rather than legal. Within weeks of their arrest, David and Jessica's financial house of cards collapsed completely. The house they'd put a deposit on in New Jersey, The seller kept their down payment and sued for additional damages. The Mercedes Jessica had purchased was repossessed. The European vacation they'd booked was non-refundable, and they lost every penny. David's employer terminated his position and voided his pension benefits when they learned about his arrest. Jessica was expelled from the master's degree program she'd enrolled in, citing fraud in her financial aid application. The private school refused to enroll Emma and Sophie, and the twins found themselves social pariahs as news of their parents' crimes spread through their community. Grace watched this destruction with mixed emotions. She felt no sympathy for David and Jessica, but her heart broke for Emma and Sophie, who were paying the price for their parents' choices. The twins were forced to move in with Jessica's sister in Pennsylvania, leaving behind their friends, their school, and their entire way of life. When they visited Grace, which Jessica's sister encouraged despite the circumstances, they were different children, aged by trauma and forced to confront adult realities no 15-year-old should face. "Grandma, why couldn't you just help them?" Sophie asked during one visit, her voice small and hurt. "Why did it have to end this way?" Grace struggled to explain concepts of justice, consequences, and self-protection to a child whose world had been shattered. "Sophie, if someone tries to hurt you, even someone you love, you have the right to protect yourself. What your parents did wasn't a mistake or poor judgment. It was a deliberate crime designed to steal my freedom and my dignity." Emma, always the more pragmatic of the twins, seemed to understand better. "They were going to put you in a nursing home against your will, weren't they? They were going to take away your choices." "Yes, sweetheart. They were going to erase me from my own life and then visit occasionally to maintain appearances. That's not love. That's control." Over the following months, Grace worked slowly to rebuild her relationships with Emma and Sophie. It was painful, complicated work, made more difficult by the twins' conflicted loyalties and their natural desire to see their family reunited. Grace set up college funds for both girls and helped Jessica's sister with their expenses. But she made clear that any relationship between them could never include David and Jessica. The twins' parents had made choices that had consequences extending far beyond their own lives. "I want you both to understand something," Grace told them during one of their visits. "What happened wasn't your fault, and it doesn't mean you're destined to make the same mistakes. You can choose to learn from your parents' errors and become stronger, more honest people because of this experience." Emma, who was planning to study education in college, seemed to find strength in the idea of building something positive from the wreckage of her family. Sophie struggled more, dealing with anger and confusion about the situation. "Sometimes I hate you for what you did to them," Sophie admitted during one particularly difficult conversation. "But then I think about what they were planning to do to you, and I feel sick. I don't know how to feel about any of this." Grace appreciated Sophie's honesty more than false forgiveness. "You don't have to know how to feel about it, sweetheart. You just have to keep growing and learning and making better choices than the ones that brought us here." The relationship Grace built with her granddaughters was different from what they'd had before. More honest, less comfortable, but ultimately stronger. They were learning to see her as a complete person rather than just a grandmother, and she was learning to love them without the mediation of their parents' expectations. Gradually, Emma and Sophie began to understand that Grace's actions, while devastating to their immediate family, had protected not just herself, but potentially future victims of David and Jessica's increasingly criminal thinking. 3 years after the arrests, Grace still lived in her Manhattan apartment, but her life had changed in ways she couldn't have anticipated. The victory over David and Jessica felt hollow most days, overshadowed by the loss of the son she'd thought she knew and the ongoing pain of watching Emma and Sophie struggle with their parents' imprisonment. David and Jessica sent letters from prison, dozens of them over the years, apologies, explanations, pleas for forgiveness, threats of legal action, demands that Grace help them appeal their sentences. Grace read none of them, having Detective Blake forward them to Joan Mitchell, who filed them as evidence of their continued lack of genuine remorse. The letters from Emma and Sophie, however, Grace treasured. Both girls were thriving despite their circumstances. Emma had been accepted to several excellent colleges and planned to study education, inspired partly by her grandmother's belief in learning from difficult experiences. Sophie had discovered a talent for debate and wanted to study law, driven by a desire to understand the justice system that had so dramatically altered her life. On a warm spring evening, as Grace prepared dinner for Emma and Sophie's monthly visit, she reflected on the choices that had brought them all to this point. She felt no regret about protecting herself from David and Jessica's scheme, but she grieved for the family relationships that had been destroyed in the process. The apartment felt different now, less like a fortress and more like a bridge between the past and whatever future she could build with the next generation. The memories were still there, but they shared space with new ones, Emma teaching her to use social media to stay connected during college, Sophie practicing debate arguments while Grace played devil's advocate, quiet conversations about resilience and recovery and the possibility of redemption. When the girls arrived that evening, bringing takeout from Grace's favorite restaurant and news about their scholarships and summer plans, Grace felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope for the future. "Grandma," Emma said, as they settled in the living room after dinner, "I've been thinking about something. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Mom and Dad had just asked for help instead of trying to steal from you?" Grace considered the question carefully. "I think about it sometimes. But Emma, the truth is that asking for help would have required them to admit they had problems. Your father's gambling, your mother's materialism, their joint inability to live within their means. They weren't ready to face those truths about themselves." Sophie nodded thoughtfully. "So they decided it was easier to make you the problem instead of dealing with their own issues." "Exactly. And that's a lesson I hope you both remember as you navigate your own adult relationships. When someone tries to make you responsible for their poor choices, or tries to solve their problems by taking away your rights and freedoms, that's not love. That's exploitation." As the evening wound down and the twins prepared to return to Pennsylvania, Grace felt the familiar mixture of sadness and gratitude that characterized her life now. She'd lost her son and daughter-in-law, but she'd gained something perhaps more valuable: a relationship with Emma and Sophie based on mutual respect rather than obligation, and the knowledge that she'd taught them to value justice over family loyalty when the two came into conflict. The apartment overlooking Central Park remained her sanctuary, but it was no longer her fortress. It had become a place where difficult truths could be spoken, where young women could learn about strength and resilience, and where an elderly woman could age with dignity and autonomy intact. Grace Williams had protected more than her home and her money. She'd protected her right to make her own choices, to maintain her own standards, and to refuse to enable destructive behavior, even when it came from people she loved. In the end, that protection had cost her dearly, but it had also saved her from a fate worse than death: the gradual erasure of everything that made her who she was. As she stood by her windows that evening, watching the lights twinkle in Central Park below, Grace felt something she hadn't experienced in years: peace with her choices and hope for tomorrow. Justice. She'd learned, wasn't always kind, but it was always necessary. And sometimes, the people who hurt you most are the ones who deserve your mercy. Least. Family. Grace had finally understood. Wasn't about blood or obligation. It was about respect, loyalty, and genuine love. Everything else was just DNA, and on that foundation, perhaps something new and stronger could be built.